Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Isabel Colchester. I'm the Chief Executive of Poet in the City, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here to Hall 1 at King's Place on behalf of us and our partners, Aurora Orchestra and Bionano. It is wonderful to have been invited to programme this performance as part of the Time Unwrapped series at King's Place, so thank you very much. In case you don't know us, Poet in the City produces classic and contemporary poetry performances, experiences and conversations, taking on major ideas, issues and people. We showcase biopics, use poetry to animate cultural movements and to peer into ideas past and present. And we create dramatic poetry experiences in major arts venues and unusual spaces. We also support young people to become the poetry producers of the future and work with many volunteers who help to make us a thriving arts community. And our partners, Aurora Orchestra, is resident orchestra here at King's Place. It combines world-class performance with adventurous programming and concert experiences, challenging expectations of what an orchestra can and should be. Aurora offers a very varied concert programme throughout the year, ranging from orchestral performances featuring some of the world's leading singers and instrumentalists to informal late-night events to storytelling concerts for families. So Aurora, it's wonderful to be working with you. And with Aurora, we share an interest in creating inspiring conversations between art forms and disciplines. So it is really wonderful to be collaborating in a venue which is home to both organisations. And tonight's programme, Memento, marks an extremely special moment as we present the world premiere of a new joint Poet in the City and Aurora commission, exploring the connection between physics, memory, music and poetry. Around a year ago, we were invited by Bionano Consulting, an organisation which is at the cutting edge of developing new scientific technologies, whether we might work with them to explore the connections between technological developments in memory storage and the way in which artists store and record memory and experience. And at a time when technology is vastly and rapidly changing our relationship to memory, this felt like a very exciting challenge. As you will hear tonight, the results are truly breathtaking. Inspired by this new technology, which you will hear much more about later, the poet Frances Leviston and composer Martin Suckling have created a new work of poetry and music which mirrors the science of collecting data at ever faster speeds, which these days takes place at microscopic scale, and considers the human scientists behind the research. The piece also questions the artist's own relationships to memory and how their work moves forward by remembering the artists in history who have most influenced them, in this case, Emily Dickinson and Franz Schubert. So a huge thank you to Bionano for sponsoring and inspiring the programme, and to all of the other partners who have supported the process, from the National Physics Laboratory to the European Commission and the King's Cross Knowledge Quarter, who first introduced us to Bionano. And I'd like to say a particular thank you to Abiola Oladipo, who has worked tirelessly with us throughout, so thank you. And tonight's programme is going to start with a discussion between the artist and the scientist Marcus Kane, before you hear the new work. And then in the second half, we will rewind history to hear those influences with performances of Emily Dickinson's poetry and Schubert's great string quintet. We have the very wonderful poet Simon Barraclough with us to host tonight, and as part of his work as an acclaimed poet and writer, Simon has a long-term interest in the crossover between the arts and science and has created numerous collections on this subject. Therefore, he really is the perfect host for tonight, so Simon, you're very welcome. So to start the evening, I'm now delighted to hand over to Frances Leviston, who's going to start us with some Emily Dickinson. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
I see thee better in the dark. I do not need a light. The love of thee a prism be, excelling violet. I see thee better for the years that hunch themselves between. The miner's lamp sufficient be to nullify the mine. And in the grave I see thee best. Its little panels be aglow, all ruddy with the light I held so high for thee. What need of day to those whose dark hath so surpassing sun? It seem it be continually at the meridian.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you, Isabel, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see such a thronged audience for tonight's event. I'm going to introduce our three special guests, and then we'll lead into the discussion. Frances Leviston, who you've just heard, was born in Edinburgh in 1982. She grew up in Sheffield and read English at St Hilda's College, Oxford. She also has an MA in creative writing from Sheffield Hallam University. In 2006, she received an Eric Gregory Award from the Society of Authors, and Public Dream, her first collection, was published by Picador in 2007 and shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Forward Prize for Best First Collection, and the Jerwood Aldborough First Collection Prize. She's a member of the Folio Academy and lives in Durham, working as a freelance writer. Martin Suckling, in the centre here, is a composer and violinist, is senior lecturer in the music department at the University of York. He has been commissioned by many leading orchestras and ensembles, including the London Symphony Orchestra, the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, BBC Philharmonic Orchestra, the Deutsches Sinfonia Orchestra Berlin, and almost too many to mention. Notable conductors of his works include Oliver Nusson, Ilan Volkov, François-Xavier Roth, Robin Ticciati, and again, countless others. His music is performed internationally to considerable critical acclaim and has won numerous awards, including the 2008 Royal Philharmonic Society Composition Prize, and most recently, a highly sought-after Philip Leverhulme Prize. Martin is published by Faber Music and was appointed Associate Composer with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra in 2013. Professor Marcus Kane, to my immediate left, is the technical coordinator of the PETMEM project. Graduating with a PhD from Warwick University in 1990, Kane spent the next 2 years in the materials department of the University of California in Santa Barbara, studying thin film epitaxial science. Something we're all very familiar with, I know. Hopefully we'll hear a bit more about that as we go. Subsequent research in the UK used many of the principles Kane learnt at Santa Barbara in the deployment of new interfacial fibre coatings for advanced high-temperature ceramic matrix composites, which I believe are used in gas turbine applications, among other things, perhaps. He joined the National Physics Laboratory in 1997 to lead the Functional Materials Research Group, and he was knowledge leader for the Materials Division at the MPL and Principal Research Scientist for the Multifunctional Materials Technical Area. In 2015, he set up his own company called Electro Sciences, and I'm going to turn to you first, Marcus, to kind of set the scientific and technological stage behind and against which our artists have created new work this evening.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. The way I normally introduce PETMEM, the project PETMEM, is, well, first of all, I'll explain what PETMEM means. It's piezoelectric transistor memory. And I introduce it normally by reminding everyone, if you look at your laptops that you have now, they'll typically run at something like 2 or 3 gigahertz. These are the speeds you buy the laptops at. But you might have noticed that the speed of operation has stagnated for the last 10 years. In 2005, it was also about 2 or 3 gigahertz. So the question is, why is that? Why has the processing speed of modern computers flatlined, basically? Why has it plateaued? And the reason is, the fundamental reason is fundamental physics. It's all about getting heat out. The faster you switch a transistor, the more heat is generated. And if you pack more transistors onto a little square inch of device, then of course you get more heat you need to get rid of, and that's been the problem. So, with that background, people are looking at, of course, alternative technologies to get over that hurdle, to be able to operate faster and faster and faster. About 5 years ago, in IBM, in the T.J. Watson Research Center in New York in the United States, hit upon a really decent, really interesting idea, using something which wasn't really thought of before to try to solve that problem. And the science behind that is the following. The technology requires 2 different materials. The first material is called a piezoelectric material. So it's a crystal of material or a ceramic, okay? And when you take one of these materials and you apply voltage to it, it changes shape. Very, very subtly, a tiny change in shape. The next material you need is piezoresistive. A piezoresistive. So what this material does is when you squeeze it, it changes its electrical resistance. So in this technology, in this PET technology, you combine these 2 things together. You take the piezoelectric and you put the piezoresistive above it and clamp it really tight. Okay? And you do this, of course, not at this scale, but at 300 nanometer length scale, okay? You can do all that. When you apply voltage to the piezoelectric, it changes shape, but it can't because it's clamped. So the stress goes up. The piezoresistive feels that stress and it changes from an insulator, it doesn't conduct electricity, to a conductor. And you can make this switch happen very, very quickly indeed, which is kind of phenomenal. It's basically a mechanical acoustic switch. It feels really old-fashioned compared to modern silicon technology, which is charge-based. This is like phonon-based. This is sound-based. It's like a sound-based electronic switch.
So it's sound and it's using actual materials.
Exactly,
ceramic
yes.
materials, yeah. And the mem part of PET-MEM is,
Yes.
is memory, isn't it? So what role does memory play in this?
So this is very important. So, of course, that technology could just be a switch. It could be some logic element or some computational element, but the memory part's really important. And if you take that piezoresistive material, you can get a material that's piezoresistive that when you squeeze it and take the pressure off, it remembers the state that it was squeezed at. So it stays conducting. And so that's what the memory is. So you can create that kind of device, apply the stress, the piezoresistive changes to conducting, take the voltage off, and it stays conducting. It's a non-volatile memory. So that's the dream of the project.
So it's not to do with kind of memory storage, it's a different kind of memory. It's the memory that the materials retain themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The material remembers its state.
And turning to Frances and Martin, there are two themes. I'm lucky enough to know the poetry you're going to hear, and I've heard the music as well. They are spectacular, as Isabel said. There are two really striking themes that came out of it for me, one of which is memory, which is intrinsically part of the technology. I wonder if I could ask you both, Frances first, how you first approached this presumably new kind of technology, new ideas to you, and how did you start changing your art form or your processes in order to respond to that? And what role did memory play in that, in any sense?
Well, I was apprehensive at first because it's completely outside of my disciplinary understanding. But that was one of the things that really attracted me to taking on the commission in the first place. And Marcus, as you've heard, is really brilliant at explaining this and making you feel like you understand it. I'm not sure I do still. One of the things I was struck by straight away at that first meeting was a similarity in the way that he was talking about putting pressure on a material and getting it to transform and change its qualities. The similarity between that and the way that poets talk about language. So it was the question of poets thinking incessantly about pressure and tension in language. How can I get more tension into this line? How can I exert more pressure onto this phrasing so that it becomes something other than ordinary everyday speech and it acquires a kind of charge? So that was a first point of contact for me with the technology that he's talking about. I also loved the language that both Marcus and his colleagues at the National Physical Laboratory were using. I did a lot of note-taking in those first meetings and kind of magpie pecking and picking up words and phrases like the pursuit of universal harmony or 1 second in the age of the universe.
And barbecules is a word that you use.
Barbules and barbicide. Oh, that came from somewhere else. I went off on all kinds of rabbit holes on the internet when I got home as well, which was fun.
It's interesting how scientific language can be an absolute source for poetry,
Yes,
can't it?
exactly. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And Martin, what was your initial response? And how does this notion of memory and or pressure apply to the work that you were doing?
Yeah, well, it was interesting hearing Frances describe the relationship of pressure and language and how that is to poetry. She could almost have been talking about music there, and you were saying how do you get the energy and within a phrase and things like that, and that's the very basis of what I'm thinking about when I'm constructing a piece of music. So this idea that there's this new technology which is based on the application of pressure to change the properties of a material, that was a very sort of fertile idea for me, because there are lots of ways in music that that idea can be related. It could be in terms of making things happen in a shorter and shorter space of time. That's a way of applying pressure, or reducing the range from high to low that something's taking place in. And then this idea that in some way transforms the material, and there's a response to that pressure that's taken place, and from that you can sort of grow larger structures. So that was part of it. And then the memory idea is, I think the thing with music, it's impossible to escape memory. Memory is what makes music work. We're sort of holding all the musical experiences that we've had and sort of comparing them to each other when we hear something. Like notes have histories, and notes on instruments have histories, and instruments have histories. You know, these are old instruments that are being played on, and they've played a lot of music, and they've heard a lot of music, and that feeds into the sorts of things that you're able to do. And I think as a composer writing new music, if you wish to communicate, which I do, you need, as well as making new experiences, there needs to be some connection to the past, to the history of these instruments, to the history of the way music works in order to take us to new places. So memory is absolutely fundamental, again, to what I do as a composer.
That's a really interesting point, but I'm also quite interested in what the pressure of this commission and of this new information did to your previously held views of musical memory or literary memory. Did you find that it was in much the way that you were describing how the materials change and the way they react differently? Did you find that you were changing the way you previously thought about your craft and your art? And if you could maybe tell us if you can remember, and often it's purely intuitive, and you know it when you hear it, but you can't theorize or make it abstract.
Yeah.
If you could maybe tell me and the audience a little bit about that process that you went through.
Yeah, shall I?
Go for it.
Yeah. I think, so there were, you're absolutely right, lots of it's irrational and instinctive, but I will try and kind of retroactively justify or rationalise some of what I did. I think one of the things it did was knowing that it was a public commission and knowing that it had a huge component of it that was non-literary, musical non-literary and scientific non-literary. It really got me out of a narrow way of thinking about writing poems as just speaking to people who read poems and just speaking to other poets and poems just speaking to other poems. So that kind of a public dimension came into the way that I was working. And I think that fed back into, to contradict myself slightly, because they are quite literary poems, because Emily Dickinson came to be a really important influence for me in writing this sequence. But one of the things I found myself able to do, I think because I was thinking less as a single poet working silently on my own on a personal project and more as a collaborator, I allowed myself to write pastiches of Emily Dickinson poems, which is something I don't usually do, certainly not deliberately. I mean, we all accidentally write pastiches sometimes, sort of embarrass ourselves. But I thought, whether or not they go into the commission in the end or not, I'll let myself soak in her words and her language and let myself try and imitate her and see what comes out of that. And that was a really new way of working for me. You know, and one of the poems, the opening poem in the sequence, is really an imitation of Emily Dickinson, imagining what she would have done with this commission.
And Martin, to come back to memory, actually, when you have Emily Dickinson, Frances, as a kind of, I think, the most kind of mentors to you. You have Franz Schubert. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about your relationship with him through this commission?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, it sort of came out of some of the things that Frances was saying. That one of the things that was different for me was working with a poet side by side. Usually when you're working with words and music, the words are there already. But in this case, that wasn't what happened. Frances and I, we met a number of times and talked about the science as we understood it and where that might take us. Yeah. And we shared sketches, but really the music and the words were written in parallel rather than in sequence. So that was a sort of significant change. And I think we sort of, you started talking about Emily Dickinson and I. Schubert came out because of the particular group of instruments that I decided to use. Aurora actually gave me free choices to what I could use, and I decided I wanted a sort of a homogeneous sound, but a rich sound, and I lit on the ensemble of 2 violins, viola, and 2 cellos, which is a very particular type of string quintet, because the major work for that is Schubert's C major string quintet, which is one of my very favourite pieces. I was absolutely obsessed with it as a teenager, and it is just beautiful, beautiful music. It's beautiful music to listen to. It's beautiful music to play. And because this ensemble, that is the one major work for that ensemble, to me, if I see that ensemble, it means Schubert to me. So for writing for these instruments, there had to be some way of acknowledging that, I think, in the music I wrote, and also just sort of thinking for the future, if the piece is going to be played again, the piece it's going to be played with is the Schubert Quintet. They're designed to go to each other. So my music does. Frances talked about pastiching Emily Dickinson. I don't pastiche Schubert, but what happens in the last movement is that you'll hear a viola melody, which there are sort of echoes of in the other instruments, and this gets put under greater and greater pressure. It gets squashed in various ways, and more energy, and at the point of highest pressure, it actually touches Schubert. There's a direct quotation a trill in the slow movement of the Schubert, and then the music sort of explodes out. And from that point to the end of the piece, the harmonic underpinning of my quintet is taken from Schubert. They're Schubert's chords. But what you hear, rather than the straight triads, are the microtonal spectra above these triads. So in one of the things that we did was to visit the National Physical Laboratory, where they showed us some images from scanning electron microscopes, and these are fantastic, incredible sort of otherworldly pictures that you see, which are there in the surface of everyday objects. And in a way, you can look at musical sound in a similar way. You can explode it out, and with just the simplest note will contain within it hundreds of different pitches and all sorts of strange microtonal combinations. And what I did with the Schubert core was to sort of bring those out, almost to help you hear these ghosts in the Schubert. And gradually it comes closer and closer and closer to Schubert's own harmony, and there start to be just sort of hints of quotes until the end point, we're almost where Schubert left us. And then the Schubert quintet can begin, but it's time for a drink before that.
Thanks very much. I'm really glad that you mentioned kind of micro levels and also the future. So I'd like to come back to you, Marcus, and talk about we're about to, in the immediate future, we're about to hear these wonderful new works, but what can we expect over the next kind of 20 years from the technology you're talking about and I believe are about to make happen?
Yes.
And the field you're in? How is it going to affect our lives? What things is it going to augment or replace or enhance?
It is a difficult question to answer, but I mean, right now it's a very critical time. We're 2 years in the project, and we just came back from a meeting in Ghent yesterday, in fact, to review the project, and we're about 4 to 6 weeks away from our first prototype device. So it's a very exciting time. If the device works as we expect it to, then we've got 2 or 3 generations beyond that to improve it. And then we think, at the moment, the first devices that we could commercialize with several tens or hundreds of millions of euros to support, of course, is probably what's called a reconfigurable antenna. So your mobile phone currently is working on 4G, so you're streaming live video. 5G is coming out in the next couple of years, so that'll be even better bandwidth. But to create proper broadband bandwidth, you need a different technology. You need to be able to access the spectrum that's available to you at any time, and you need to be able to switch between these spectrum. And the best way of doing that is using low power, fast, switchable electronics, which is what PET does. So we reckon the first application is 6G mobile phone, okay? And so this is, we will see this maybe, if it works, we'll see this in maybe 5, 6 years, 7 years, something like that.
And will that free up people to create brand new things that can run over that? Do you think you'll have that knock-on in
You can imagine, yeah. The Internet of Things, okay, where everything's got some sort of like self-powered processing, like Fitbit watches and all these sorts of things. All these technologies require fast, cheap, because they're battery-powered often, technologies, and that's kind of what's missing, and we think PET-MEM can do that, can deliver that. In terms of memory applications, to replace current memory applications is going to take much longer because we need to be able to shrink the device another order of magnitude in scale. That's possibly doable, but it might take 10 years.
Which reminds me of something Martin was saying about shrinking the pitch space around certain notes. So I think you're going to hear, whether you kind of know it or not in this performance, you're going to hear scientific theories applied to music and to poetry. And I just want to finish, we've got about a minute and a half here. We often talk about what artists learn from scientists, and we learn a hell of a lot, and it's a wonderful source for us, and we're continually raiding it for the beautiful stories, and we pull up short when we don't quite understand the theoretical maths there, and we won't go beyond that. But I'd like to ask you, Marcus, what you have learned through your work on this project from Martin and Frances, and do you see how it will affect your work? I like to think it's a two-way, a feedback circuit.
It was always set up to be a collaboration, so we not just about a dissemination vehicle for the European project, novel and unique though it is, of course. But I also believe that we can all learn from each other looking at it from a different point of view, a different perspective. And I found it fascinating that what you've just said actually about every musical instrument has got a history built into it. You can't undo it. It's got a history. And in fact, these materials have history. They're called history dependent. I mean, it's phenomenal. That, then it's phenomenal. And the poetry, you hit upon the importance and significance of looking deeper and deeper into a structure, into a material, using the scanning electron microscope, and you talked about that in your poems. And I don't want to ruin it for everyone, but this is so important because the fundamental properties of these materials are determined, they're dominated by the intrinsic, minute to atomic level movement of atoms and so on in the structures in the material. So I think it makes you stop and makes you think differently, certainly.
Well, that's a fantastic moment to stop on. I think thank you very much for taking part in this discussion, your contribution, and we look forward to seeing the results immediately. So we're going to get off the stage here, and there's a slight transition phase where we'll be setting up the stage for the orchestra. So thank you very much. Would you like to give everyone a warm round of applause?
Directions here. This whole thing is be a cucumber.
Emily's electrical absence. Technologies are not abrupt, though pole vaults may appear. The lever bends a longer spell than morals in a fire, and clatters off the bar before it ever clears the way, and makes the mass astonished cheer a bruised, inverted thigh. Inwards all things pressured go, Sponges drop their tents. The mirandizing brain retreats from risk to precedent. Blades by hammers flattened out swell around the blows like proving bread, but if they're stopped, all forces pass for screws. Had angels bones, they would of quartz be slenderly compiled, and none would know what minerals musculature concealed, what cloudy pins, what lambent plates moved them to and fro, and gave them heartless energy to trees with feathers plough. But if you took an angel's hand and pressed in friendship's name, catastrophe, a lightning strike would crystallize your arm. White box, pained, permanent wakefulness, exposed in the split geode, a Santa's grotto. Jagged milk quartz crusts constitute every surface, a mouth all teeth, self-sharpening like sea urchins. Uncomfortably beautiful, toughened glass spikes in the doorways of award-winning offices, rough sleepers from the womb condemned to make of anything succulent rock, of porticos, iron maidens. in an alabaster chamber. All the frescoes are peering down at these interlopers, raw, untutored chunks of marble, a pedigree of sorts, but absolutely unrefined, each one set on a stoneworker's desk, as if it's a pedestal. The dull lions of Venice disapprove. This specimen, sitting on a cloud, observing crosswise the marriage chariot glide across a scumbled firmament, but never, thank goodness, getting there, wishes they could send it back from whence it came. And the marble, too, restored to the palace it's part of, the negative palace in the hills above Carrara, for which a score of quarriers will have sacrificed hands. The sugar cube grittiness, the horsehair impasto, and faint glitter of alien minerals adhering to the motherstone matrix the marble provides, make the lion slump with apprehension. Grey sediment spidering through it reminds him of original sin, the clogged lung and clay bedded down under the soul's claws, Tiepolo's fingernails, when the nuptial allegory was brought into generous being. And all the little tools exposed in the stoneworkers' desks, like stationery sets for vicious schoolboys, clattering with chisels and picks and hammers, remind the lion how easily he might be scratched or his flatness scrubbed out of existence, were someone determined to strip the walls right back to the underlying stone, the polished blocks those carbuncles are only cousin to. Everything should stay where it belongs, he could groan, from his pattered cloud on plaster clinging upside down to the ceiling of a dazzling palazzo, propped on wooden stilts, sunk in the middle of a silty lagoon. I see thee better. Behind her now, the National History Museum pocket microscope she always screwed down to its farthest extension of nested rings, straining to focus the peacock feather stolen from the dining room's display of stiff-dried flowers and fed forwards onto the stage, a blurred blue petrol and purple fronding of fine barbules and barbicels, netting white light, broken out of straightness and scattering green and bronze before the eyes appeared, optical illusions blinking between the rhacades, like faces half hidden behind wooden masks, half hidden in the trees. Behind her now that closer meant clearer, learning to pull back and let the light do its work, revealing the lion's ruff on a scalloped oak moth, the canyons in a cone. then wising up, withdrawing into augmentedness. I see thee better in the dark. I do not need a light. Firing electrons at a stage 1,000th the width of a human hair, without an audience. The only way of telling what's happening there, between the grains, the photons' murmurations. Not to see it, but to send the beam out and watch for what comes back. Shots in the net, renderings, a dream that splits the night. pursuit of universal harmony. What slow terror would accompany the sudden loss of the prototype kilogram, kept under triple lock beneath the triple bell jar in the Parc de Saint-Cloud in the suburbs of Paris? 1 second in the age of the universe, 1 spore in a European map of mould, 1 yard at the speed of a racing yacht, 1 degree Kelvin to the cold. What eulogy for this last remaining base unit measured against an artefact, a particular lump in the world, rather than gauged against the unchanging principles physics derives from any lumps or beams it likes. 1 microbead in a bottom feeder's belly, 1 chip of gravel in a grave on Saint Michel, 1 zero in a tower block of binary, 1 penny in the hard cell. What becomes of a holy relic of Victorian-era cooperation between European nations? A polyglot ingot, ferried back and forth between London and Paris for polishing, steam cleaned like a pale carpet. 1 sequin in a drag queen's wardrobe, 1 tip in a betting career, 1 wing beat in a hummingbird's courtship, 1 word in a therapist's ear. Not so conspicuous as to be missed by a great many people at first, would it pass unremarked for weeks, months, years, before the loss of its absolute steadiness registered underfoot? 1 small-toe in St. Mark's Basilica, 1 hair in a lion's outstanding mane, 1 tick of an orbital atomic clock, 1 neuron in a remembering brain.